Welcome to Supply Chain Talks. In this tutorial, we are going to talk about purchase order. Purchase order is a legal contract between the buyer and the seller. Thus, it is very important that the right information and the terms and conditions should be mentioned by the buyer in the purchase order. And the supplier should also check each and everything in the purchase order before providing their acceptance and acknowledgement. Because once the acknowledgement and acceptance is provided by the supplier to the buyer, it becomes a legal contract between the two entities. A purchase order can be divided into three components: the header, the body, and the footer. Let's have a look at what should go into the header of the purchase order. The header of the purchase order should have the purchase order number mentioned, the date of the issuance of the purchase order, the contact details of the buyer, the billing address, that is where should the supplier send the invoice against this purchase order, the vendor contact details, the Incoterms, the mode of transportation, road, rail, sea, air. The reference to the vendor quotation should be mentioned. The payment terms agreed should also be mentioned on the purchase order. The delivery address should be there. The required or tentative delivery date should also be mentioned. So these are the components of the header of the purchase order. Let's have a look at what should be mentioned in the body of the purchase order. In the body, the name of the material or service being acquired should be clearly mentioned. If there is a vendor part number, that should also be mentioned. The buyer material code or system code should be clearly mentioned. The ordered quantity should be there. Unit of measure should also be mentioned. This is very important because there might be a confusion that you require the quantity in pieces, whereas the vendor might be giving the item in some other unit, like for example kg or in liters. The unit price should be mentioned. If there are any discounts which were offered by the supplier, they should be mentioned. If a contract was established between the buyer and the seller, then the contract reference should also be mentioned. Freight costs, documentation cost should be there. If there is a defined delivery schedule, that should be mentioned. Delivery instructions should also be there. If there are any applicable taxes like VAT or withholding tax, that should come in the body of the purchase order. And the most important part are the authorized signatures. Along with the signatures, it is recommended that the name and the title of the person who is signing the purchase order should also be mentioned on it, along with the date on which the signature was done. This defines the body of the purchase order. Let's have a look at what should go into the footer of the purchase order. Terms and conditions should be mentioned in the footer of the purchase order. If there are any penalty clauses, they should be there. Any environment, health and safety requirements should also be mentioned. Business conduct guidelines should be there. If the company has these, then they should be ideally mentioned. A reference to anti-corruption and compliance guidelines should also be mentioned. Material receiving and quality guidelines of the buying company should be clearly mentioned on the purchase order. If there are any quality standards that need to be followed for the material or the service, that should also be mentioned over here. Termination clauses should be mentioned, that is, in what conditions can the purchase order or contract be terminated, or the steps that should be taken in order to terminate the purchase order. We have now seen that what details need to go into the purchase order, and with the kind of details that I have mentioned, it is very much understandable that how important a purchase order is. So be very diligent about these details when you are establishing a purchase order. This concludes our session on purchase order. Thank you. If you have any comments or questions, kindly leave them in the comment section below.